Olivier Eugène Prosper Charles Messiaen was born on December 10, 1908 in Avignon, France. His father Pierre was an English teacher originally from just outside of Verviers-Sud, while his mother Cécile was a poet originally from La Roche-sur-Yon. He also had a brother named Alain, who also was a poet. Two of Cécile's poems make reference to her unborn son. These poems deeply influenced the young Olivier, later claiming them as a prophecy for his artistic career. Pierre enlisted into the French military at the outbreak of World War I, with Cécile moving the family to the city of Grenoble in the southeast. Olivier became fascinated with drama, often reciting the works of William Shakespeare to his brother. They even had a homemade toy theater. Despite his family not being very religious, Olivier converted to Catholicism, which would become a large influence on his music. After teaching himself how to play, Olivier began taking piano lessons. Some early influences included Debussy and Ravel. He would also receive multiple vocal scores of various operas for Christmas and would also save up to buy himself scores. One of the scores he bought was Edvard Grieg's Peer Gynt, which he claimed the, quote, beautiful Norwegian melodic lines with a taste of folk song gave me a love of melody. In 1918, Pierre returned from the war. The family then moved to the city of Nantes. Olivier continued his music lessons under Jean de Gibon. Interestingly, Gibon didn't charge for his lessons even though he was poor. He would also give Olivier the score to Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande, which Messiaen described as, quote, a thunderbolt and probably the most decisive influence on me. The family then moved to Paris after Pierre got a teaching position in the city. In 1919, at age 10 or 11, Messiaen entered the Paris Conservatory. Some of his teachers included Jean Galland, Charles-Marie Wieder, and his organ teacher Marcel Dupré. Messiaen made incredible progress in the conservatoire, winning multiple prizes in various categories. He would also develop an interest in ancient Greek rhythms and modes through his composition teacher, Maurice Emmanuel. According to Dupré, Messiaen had never seen an organ before studying under him. As Dupré was demonstrating the instrument, Messiaen sat quietly for an hour. The next week, Messiaen came back and played Bach's Fantasia and Fugue in C minor at an impressive level. Messiaen's mother died in 1927, which left him in grief. Despite this, he began studying composition under the newly hired Paul Dukas. Messiaen's first major work to be performed was his orchestral suite Les Enfants Jubilés, which premiered in 1931 at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, conducted by Walter Strauram. After hearing a gamelan performance, he became interested in pitched percussion. Other pieces written around this time include 8 preludes for piano and Le Banquet Céleste for organ. In 1929, Messiaen began subbing as a titular organist at the Église de la Sainte Trinité Church. After the previous organist's death 2 years later, he officially applied for the position. He received support from his teachers, with Wieder even writing a letter of recommendation. He was officially appointed to the position in 1931, remaining as the organist for the church for over 60 years. During his tenure, Messiaen made multiple modifications to the organ, including adding registers and electrifying the transmission, whatever that means. He went so far as to refuse playing on any other organs, including the one in Notre Dame. In 1932, Messiaen married violinist Claire Delbo. Their marriage inspired him to write a theme and variations for violin and piano, as well as a song cycle Poème pour me. In 1935, Messiaen wrote his first major work for organ, the 9-movement La Nativité du Seigneur. It premiered 2 years later at the Sainte Trinité Church, the performance being split up between organists Daniel Lezeur, Jean Longley, and Jean-Jacques Gounenwald. In 1936, Messiaen formed a group called La Jeune France with Lezeur, along with composers André Jolivet and Yves Baudelaire. The group attacked the frivolity of contemporary Parisian music, favoring, quote, living music, having the impetus of sincerity, generosity, and artistic conscientiousness. Messiaen would soon leave the group, however. After multiple miscarriages, Messiaen and his wife had a son named Pascal in 1937, with Messiaen writing a song cycle to celebrate. He would also arrange some of his orchestral works for organ, including L'Ascension. Messiaen was drafted into the army following the French entry into World War II. Due to his poor eyesight, he was enlisted as a medical auxiliary. Messiaen would be captured in Verdun and taken to the Stalag Act A POW camp. While there, he met clarinetist Henri Acoca, cellist Etienne Pasquier, and violinist Jean Le Boulez. Messiaen began writing a trio for them, which eventually resulted in arguably one of the greatest masterpieces of the 20th century, Quatuor pour la fin du temps. The piece was premiered in the POW camp to an audience of prisoners and guards on poor quality instruments in freezing conditions. Messiaen would be released from the camp in mid-1941 after some persuasion from Dupré. He would find himself becoming a household name, and was appointed as professor of harmony at the Paris Conservatoire, where he taught until the late 1970s. While Messiaen was only in his mid-30s, he was described as an outstanding teacher. Of his many, and I mean many, students, some of his more well-known ones include Pierre Boulez, Caroline Stockhausen, Gerd Kurtag, as well as Yannis Xenakis and Pinus Ivan Loriot. Messiaen would write 3 pieces for Loriot to play from 1943 to 1944, helped by her masterful skills as a pianist. The first piece was his Vision de la Main for 2 pianos, commissioned for the Concert de la Pléiade during the German occupation of Paris. The second was his 2-hour-long piano cycle, Vents la Garde sur l'Enfant Jésus, which premiered at the Salle Gaveau concert hall shortly after the liberation of Paris. The third was his controversial cantata, Trois petites liturgies de la présence divine, which features a difficult solo piano part. The piece was well received by the public, but not by the critics, with one musicologist describing it as a, quote, work of tinsel, false magnificence, and pseudo-mysticism. In 1944, Messiaen published a treatise titled Technique de mon langage musical, describing his, well, musical language. Who wrote this script? 3 years later, his wife received an operation which caused her to lose her memory. She would spend the rest of her life in mental institutions. Despite this, he would write 3 pieces inspired by the legend of Tristan and Isolde. Harawi, written in 1945 and incorporated elements of Peruvian folk song, was premiered in Brussels with soprano Marcel Boulay as a soloist. Next was the 10-movement Turangalîla-Symphonie, written in 1948, commissioned by Boston symphony conductor Sergei Kouzevitsky, although the premiere was instead conducted by Leonard Bernstein as Kouzevitsky was sick. The last was a Centre Chant for a cappella, also written in 1948. The following year, Messiaen visited the US, where his works were conducted by Kouzevitsky and Leopold Stokowski. It was around this time when Messiaen began experimenting with many contemporary techniques, including the 12-tone technique similar to Arnold Schoenberg, I want that purple stuff, as well as musique concrète, first pioneered by Edgar Varel. Messiaen had a lifelong fascination with birdsong, having incorporated aspects of it in his music. When asked to provide a test piece for the flute studio of the Conservatoire, he wrote Le Mail Noir in 1952. Unlike his previous pieces, which only incorporated small amounts of birdsong, Le Mail Noir was based entirely on birdsong, specifically that of the blackbird, as in the name. British music critic Paul Griffiths argues that Messiaen was the one composer most interested in ornithology, and was more musically observant of birdsong than even the most distinguished ornithologists. Some other works that included birdsong include Ravel des Oiseaux, Oiseaux exotiques, and Catalogue d'Oiseaux. You can probably guess what Oiseaux means by now. In 1959, Messiaen's wife died. 2 years later, he married Loriot. It was around this time when Messiaen began extensively traveling, attending musical events and transcribing the songs of birds out in the wild. His wife would assist him by recording bird songs on tape. Messiaen was commissioned to write Chronochomie for the 1960s Donaueschingen Festival. Additionally, Boulez would program premieres of Messiaen's pieces at the festival. While on his honeymoon in Japan in 1962, Messiaen wrote Set Haikai. The piece was inspired by gagaku music and no theater, and featured stylized imitations of traditional Japanese instruments. He was then commissioned by the French Minister of Cultural Affairs to write Et exspecto resurrectionem mortuorum in 1964, dedicating the piece to those who lost their lives in both world wars. The piece was publicly premiered a year later at the Chartres Cathedral. Among those in the audience was French President Charles de Gaulle. Messiaen's reputation as a composer continued to grow throughout the 1960s, receiving multiple awards and honors. Messiaen was officially appointed as the professor of composition at the Paris Conservatoire in 1966, though he had already been teaching composition for years. 3 years later, he completed his largest scale work up to that point, the oratorio La Transfiguration de Notre Seigneur Jésus-Christ. The text used was from the Gospel of Matthew and his account of the Transfiguration of Jesus, as well as some excerpts from Summa Theologica by St. Thomas Aquinas. And when I say large scale, I do mean large scale. The piece premiered in Lisbon, conducted by Serge Baldo. Messiaen was then commissioned by American singer Alice Tully to write a piece for the United States Bicentennial, and by Rolf Lieberman to write an opera for the Paris Opera. For the former piece, Messiaen visited the US again in 1972, and was inspired by the birdsong and colors of Bryce Canyon National Park in Utah. The result was Des Canyons aux Étoiles, which premiered at the Lincoln Center in New York in 1974. As for the latter piece commissioned by Lieberman, Messiaen initially refused, but French President Georges Pompidou persuaded him to do so. After 8 years of writing, orchestrating, and copying, Messiaen finished his Saint-François d'Assise in 1983, his only opera. It premiered that year at the Palais Garnier, conducted by Seiji Ozawa, and is considered by many to be Messiaen's magnum opus. Some even believe that the opera would be Messiaen's last work, a sentiment shared by Messiaen himself. However, he would continue to compose. An operation left him unable to attend his 70th birthday celebrations in 1978, but he was able to celebrate his 80th birthday 10 years later by attending a performance of his opera in London. The year before, he was awarded the Grand Croix, the highest honor of the Légion d'honneur. Despite multiple surgeries on his back in the late 80s and early 90s, Messiaen wrote Éclair sous l'au-delà, his last completed work. It premiered at the Lincoln Center 6 months after his death, with Zubin Mehta conducting the New York Philharmonic. On April 27, 1992, Olivier Messiaen died in a hospital in the commune of Clichy. Loriot soon after discovered that her husband had been writing a quadruple concerto for her, cellist Mieczyslaw Rostropovich, oboist Heinz Hollager, and flutist Catherine Cantan. With the help of composer and Messiaen student Sir George Benjamin, Loriot finished the concerto and it was premiered in 1994. Loriot then died in 2010. In his book Olivier Messiaen and the Music of Time, Griffith states that Messiaen's style was largely outside of the Western musical tradition. Much of his output rejects the Western conventions of forward motion, development, and diatonic resolution. This is reinforced by Messiaen's study and absorption of ancient Greek and Hindu rhythms, as well as the music of East Asia, particularly with gamelan and Japanese music. Despite his nonconformity to the Western musical tradition, Messiaen would still maintain a degree of Western influence. He admired the works of composers including Debussy, Rameau, Chopin, as well as Stravinsky, Mussorgsky, Scarlatti, Isaac Albéniz, and Heitor Villa-Lobos. Throughout his career, Messiaen would continually evolve compositional techniques, integrating them into his style. According to French music critic Claude Samuel, Messiaen considered the development of these techniques as a means to intellectual, aesthetic, and emotional ends. If you couldn't tell by the titles of his pieces, Messiaen was a devout Catholic for his entire life. He would say of his faith, quote, "I am lucky enough to be Catholic. I was born a believer, and it happened that the sacred text struck me from early childhood. A certain number of my works are therefore destined to shed light on the theological truths of the Catholic faith." Messiaen believed that music should follow 3 criteria. It must be interesting, be beautiful to listen to, and touch the listener. One of the more important aspects of Messiaen's music is color, largely due to his synesthesia. He believed that musical terms such as tonal, modal, and serial to be misleading. To Messiaen, music either had color or it didn't. He would go so far as to notate colors in some of his scores in order to help the conductor in their interpretation of his works. Arguably the most notable aspect of Messiaen's music would be his compilation of what are called modes of limited transposition, which are, from what I understand, groups of notes that can only be transposed by a semitone a certain number of times. In addition, 2 of these notes must be the same pitch class. Messiaen himself would compile 7 of these modes. He would also make use of additive rhythms, which is the slight lengthening or shortening of individual notes. This often necessitated the use of rhythmic cells rather than traditional time signatures. Lastly, Messiaen is quite famous for his frequent use of extremely slow tempi. The slowest that I could find is the 5th movement of Quatuor, where the 16th note equals 44. How slow is that, you ask? Here's the quarter note. The reasons for these unbearably slow tempi is that it contributes to the suspension of the conventional perception of time, which Messiaen used throughout his career. His impact on classical music is nothing short of massive. As mentioned before, Messiaen had a huge list of people who studied under him. In addition to the ones already mentioned, some others include Alexander Gur, Jacques Etu, Jigong Chen, and even American record producer Quincy Jones. Also mentioned before, Messiaen received many accolades throughout his life. This includes 2 honorary doctorates from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and the former Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. He also has a music competition, an asteroid, and even a mountain in Utah named after him.